On Christmas Eve, as carols played softly and candles flickered, my sister Olivia smirked across the table. "Maybe Catherine should try housekeeping at Grand Line. At least that's real work." Laughter spilled from Mark. My parents stayed silent, and their silence cut sharper than any words. Then my mother turned to me, her voice colder than the snow outside. "Amanda gets the guest room. The garage is ready for you, Catherine." In that moment, the family I once longed to belong to showed me exactly where they thought I stood. Among boxes and dust not beside them. They waited for me to break, but instead I smiled because what they didn't know was that the garage was not my prison. It was the stage for my revenge. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. Snow fell heavy outside the windows, blanketing the streets of Cleveland in white. Christmas lights shimmered across the neighborhood, every house glowing with warmth and color. Inside our dining room, the table was set to impress. White linen stretched across the long oak table, polished silverware gleamed under the chandelier. Red candles flickered beside a perfectly roasted turkey, and a bottle of Cabernet breathed on the sideboard. It looked like a picture from a holiday magazine, but the air was heavy, thick with something bitter that had nothing to do with the smell of gravy. I sat halfway down the table, my hands around the fork and knife. My knuckles were pale, and though I tried to steady myself, my fingers trembled against the silverware. I pressed harder, hoping no one noticed. Across from me, Olivia leaned back in her chair, wine glass balanced carelessly between her fingers. At 32, she had perfected the art of a cruel smile. Sweet on the surface, sharp as glass underneath. Her lips curled as she said, maybe Catherine could apply for a job at Grand Line. Housekeeping, perhaps? At least that's real work. The words cut through the room like a knife. Mark, her husband, immediately burst out laughing. His laughter was too loud, too eager, the kind that filled the silence and left no space for dignity. "Now that's a thought," he said, smirking at me. "At least you'd get free staff meals." I swallowed hard, tasting nothing. My father Richard cleared his throat but didn't speak. My mother Linda didn't even look my way. Her eyes stayed on her plate, but I saw it in her expression. The small flicker of satisfaction. Their silence was worse than laughter. It was agreement. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to breathe. I'd been here before. Christmas after Christmas, I had been the family's favorite target. I remembered being 19 home from college and Olivia mocking me for taking an art class. "So you'll paint pictures and starve," then she'd said. Everyone had laughed. That year I had run to the bathroom in tears. Another Christmas when I was 24 and struggling with 2 part-time jobs, Mark had joked in front of my cousins Catherine should put professional failure on her resume. My father hadn't stopped him. My mother had smiled thinly as if it were only harmless fun. I had cried then, too. My tears had always been their entertainment, but not this time. This time I lifted my head, my fork steadied. I drew in a breath and I let a faint smile touch my lips. I knew Olivia saw it because for the briefest second her smirk faltered. "Linda." My mother broke the silence. Her voice was calm, rehearsed, and merciless. "Amanda needs the guest room," she said, gesturing toward my younger sister at the far end of the table. Amanda's hand rested over her rounded belly, 6 months along. "She's pregnant. She needs her rest." Amanda looked down, avoiding my eyes. She didn't speak. She never did in moments like these. Linda's gaze shifted back to me, colder now, flat as stone. "The garage is ready for you, Catherine." The words struck, but I didn't flinch. For a moment there was nothing but the sound of the fire crackling in the hearth and the faint Christmas carols playing on the old stereo. The rest of the family turned toward me, waiting. They always waited. For the protest, the crack in my voice, the tears they could feed on. I felt their eyes like weight pressing down on me. Olivia's smirk grew. Mark leaned back in satisfaction. Even my father stared harder at his plate as though already rehearsing his excuse for not defending me. Inside my heart pounded each beat echoing in my ears. My throat ached with the memory of old humiliation. But I pushed it down. I nodded once, a simple dip of my chin. "I understand," I said. My voice was steady, smooth, without tremor. Olivia blinked, her triumph interrupted by confusion. Mark glanced at her, waiting for another punchline. My mother frowned as if my calmness was an insult to the script she had written for me. "Of course, Amanda needs comfort," I added evenly. "I'll manage." I set my fork down gently on the plate and lifted my glass of water. I drank slowly, deliberately, and when I placed it back on the table, I smiled. Not warmly, not kindly, but with a quiet composure they had never seen before. The room shifted almost imperceptibly. The conversation resumed, but not as freely, not with the same easy cruelty. My father finally glanced at me briefly and then looked away again, uncomfortable. Olivia tapped her fingernail against her glass, restless, unsatisfied. I picked up my fork once more and cut into the turkey, chewing slowly. Inside, a storm raged, but outwardly I was calm. The garage, the cold, the humiliation. It no longer mattered. What mattered was what they didn't know. I looked around the table at the people who thought they held me in place, and I let that small, steady smile remain. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the weak one at the table. Olivia's heels clicked against the hardwood as she walked me down the narrow hallway toward the back door. She didn't bother lowering her voice. She wanted everyone left at the table to hear the echo of her authority. She swung the door open and stepped aside with a flourish, her perfume sharp against the draft of winter air. "Here we are," she said, her tone syrupy with sarcasm. "Perfect for you. Like camping, right? You always liked roughing it." She flipped on the light. A single yellow bulb sputtered to life, illuminating the garage in weak shadows. The smell of gasoline and dust stung my nose. Stacks of plastic bins towered against the walls, old bicycles leaned at crooked angles, and in the middle of it all sat a rusty, fold-out cot with a thin mattress bent from years of disuse. A scratchy blanket was folded on top, stiff from storage. A small space heater hummed in the corner, its orange glow too faint to cut through the cold seeping from the concrete floor. The place looked more like a storage locker than a room for a human being. Olivia leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed, eyes glittering. Mom thought it was perfect. Cozy, don't you think? Who needs the guest room when you have this? She laughed once, a dry, brittle sound. I met her gaze. I didn't flinch, didn't give her the reaction she wanted. Her smile thinned. She gave a small shrug, then let the door swing shut behind her with a final thud. The sound echoed like a lock, though I knew it wasn't. Silence settled. Only the weak hum of the heater and the faint whistle of the wind outside filled the space. I stood there for a moment, letting the cold sink into my bones. My breath rose in pale clouds, the garage swallowing the warmth from my body. My eyes drifted across the clutter. Old Christmas decorations in cardboard boxes, a broken lawn chair, golf clubs propped carelessly in a corner. This was where they thought I belonged. Among forgotten things, out of sight, out of mind, I sat down on the cot. The springs groaned beneath my weight. The mattress was thin, barely cushioning me from the steel frame. I pressed my hands into the blanket, rough against my fingers, and exhaled slowly. Memories returned unbidden. I was 12 again, proud and eager, holding a ceramic vase I had made in art class. I had wrapped it carefully in tissue paper, tied it with ribbon, and placed it under the tree for my mother. On Christmas morning, she had unwrapped it, smiled politely, and set it on the mantel. By New Year's, it was gone. Months later, I found it in the attic, broken in two, shoved into a box with old lampshades. Then 16, standing in the dining room after winning a statewide essay contest. I had been so proud, clutching the letter in my hand. "That's nice," my father had said without looking up from his plate. "Pass the salt." Olivia rolled her eyes. Amanda talked about her college acceptance, and the moment slipped away, dismissed as nothing. Year after year, achievement after achievement, they erased me. I had been the extra, the afterthought, the shadow. I clenched my jaw, dragging myself back to the present. The cold was biting, but my resolve burned hotter. They would never see me cry again. They would never taste my humiliation. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket. The screen lit up the dim space with a blue glow. Notifications poured in one after another. Subject lines stacked across the display. Urgent. CEO attention required. Final review. Needed. Acquisition contract. Immediate response. Board request. Each one carried my name at the top. Not Catherine the disappointment. Not Catherine the teacher scraping by on adjunct pay. Catherine Wilson, CEO. The irony was almost laughable. Just a few steps away, my family laughed and drank smug in their belief that I was beneath them. Here in the cold garage, the truth glowed in my palm. I scrolled reading quickly. David, my lead counsel, outlining final hurdles in the acquisition of a competitor. Maria, my COO, flagging logistics in Chicago. Ben, my CFO, attaching fresh projections for the new quarter. Chloe, my assistant, reminding me that Charles Benson, the very man sipping wine at my parents' table, had called 5 times that day, demanding to meet the mysterious head of Aurora Hotels. I smiled in the dim light, the first genuine smile of the evening. They thought they had banished me. What they had done was place me exactly where I needed to be, outside their warmth in the cold, where clarity sharpened. The heater buzzed weakly, and the cot creaked as I leaned back, phone still in my hand. My breath fogged in the air as I read line after line of correspondence decisions that would shift millions of dollars and hundreds of lives. In here, surrounded by dust and shadows, I was more powerful than they could ever comprehend. And I knew as I pressed my finger to reply that the real story of this Christmas had only just begun. The chill of the concrete pressed through the thin mattress as I set my phone aside and pulled my old laptop from the bag at my feet. The screen flickered before settling into its faint glow, humming like a loyal friend that had carried me through years of sleepless nights. The garage smelled of dust and motor oil, but as the cursor blinked on the screen, my mind drifted far from this place. I was 22 again, back in 2012, clutching the keys to a run-down motel on the edge of Las Vegas. The Sunset Inn was what the faded neon sign read, though half the letters no longer lit. The building had been half empty for years, paint peeling from the walls, carpets sticky from decades of neglect. It wasn't a dream purchase. It wasn't glamorous. But it was mine. $200,000 scraped together from tutoring jobs, waiting tables, even cleaning houses, and every last cent of a small bank loan. That was all I had. Everyone told me I was insane. Maybe I was. I remembered walking those halls the first night, fluorescent lights buzzing, every step echoing. I scrubbed bathrooms until my hands were raw, stripped-stained sheets from beds argued with suppliers for fair prices I could barely afford. I worked 18 hours a day, sometimes more. My body ached, but my mind was alive with ideas. Maria was the first to join me. She had been a housekeeper there before the previous owners gave up. I offered her a position, a modest salary, but promised her a future if she stayed. She believed me. She stayed. Together we painted walls, replaced carpets, patched roofs. Slowly we attracted guests. Slowly the numbers began to move. By 2015, I had added 2 more small properties. Nothing fancy, just places no one else wanted. By 2018, I had rebranded them under one name: Aurora Luxury Hotels. The word luxury was ambitious back then. The reality was more survival than luxury, but I held on to the vision. Every deal, every new acquisition came with its sacrifices. I still remember flying to New York for my first big contract in 2019, sitting in a glass tower conference room overlooking the city skyline. My hands trembled as I signed the paperwork that would secure financing for our expansion. I was 29, barely holding myself together in a borrowed blazer that didn't quite fit. When the deal closed, the bankers shook my hand, congratulated me, and went home to their families. I bought takeout and ate alone in a small hotel room, staring out at the lights of Manhattan, wondering if my parents would ever understand what I had just accomplished. They never did. By 2024, Aurora Luxury Hotels had grown beyond anything I had imagined that first night in Las Vegas. A flagship resort in New York, a thriving property in Chicago, renovations underway in Miami. The company had been valued at $250 million just last quarter. Plans for an IPO were already in motion. Maria was now my COO. Ben, my CFO, kept the books sharper than any blade. David handled the legal battles with precision. Chloe, bright and efficient, ran my days with flawless control. And yet here I was, shivering in my parents' garage, treated as though I were still the failure, the burden the extra child shoved aside. The contrast was absurd. It might have broken me once. Now it only fueled me. The heater buzzed weakly in the corner, the light bulb overhead flickered. My inbox chimed again. Another urgent message. Chloe this time. Mr. Benson is frantic, her text read. He has called 5 times today. He wants to meet the CEO immediately. He's demanding answers about the acquisition. He doesn't know it's you. I stared at her words, the corners of my mouth curving upward. Charles Benson, the CEO of Grand Line Hospitality. The man who had sat at my parents' table just hours ago, smiling warmly at Olivia, praising her as one of his rising stars. He had no idea. He didn't know that Aurora held controlling shares. He didn't know that the elusive, faceless figure he was desperate to meet was sitting here in this freezing garage in Ohio, wrapped in a threadbare blanket. I let out a soft laugh, quiet and sharp, the sound bouncing off the concrete walls. Life had a cruel sense of irony. I closed my eyes, inhaling deeply, letting the cold air fill my lungs. For years, I had let them think I was small, invisible, insignificant. Tonight, I had given them what they wanted. Silence, obedience, the picture of defeat. But the truth was already in motion, unstoppable. Chloe's message blinked again at the top of the screen. I typed a short reply. Tell him the CEO is reviewing final contracts. We'll speak soon. I hit send and leaned back against the cot. The metal frame creaked beneath me, the garage still cold, still unforgiving. But inside I felt nothing but fire. They thought they had banished me. What they had really done was set the stage. And soon the performance would begin. The morning light seeped through the thin curtains of the garage, pale and cold, illuminating the dust hanging in the air. My back ached from the cot, my breath visible in the chill. I pulled my sweater tighter and rubbed warmth into my arms before opening the door quietly. The house was awake. I could hear voices drifting from the living room. I paused in the hallway, hidden by the corner wall, the scent of coffee wafting through the air. My father's voice carried calm but firm. Linda, we need to make this clear. The house, the pension, everything we've saved. It should go to Olivia and Amanda. They'll need it. Catherine, she'll have to manage on her own. The words landed heavy, though they shouldn't have surprised me. My mother agreed with a small sigh. It's for the best. Olivia is building her career. Amanda will have a baby soon. Catherine has always been independent, hasn't she? She'll find her way. Independent. That was their word for abandoned. Olivia's voice chimed in, bright and satisfied. It makes sense. I mean, let's be honest. Catherine never showed much promise. She doesn't need the stress of a mortgage or estate planning. Leave it to the ones who can handle it. My heart squeezed, but I stayed still, pressing against the wall. Amanda's voice was softer, hesitant. Maybe Catherine should have something too. Her words trailed off, almost embarrassed, and the silence that followed made it clear she wouldn't push further. I lowered my eyes, staring at the hardwood floor beneath me. For years, some small part of me had held on to the foolish hope that when it came down to it, they would treat me fairly, that maybe blood meant something, that maybe despite everything they would see me. But the illusion shattered with each casual word from their mouths. The living room grew quiet, mugs clinking, papers rustling. I backed away, careful not to make a sound, and slipped out the back door into the sharp December air. The cold hit my lungs, crisp and biting, but it steadied me. I pulled my phone from my pocket and scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I needed. David Miller. My attorney, my shield in 1,000 battles. I pressed call and held the phone close. He answered on the second ring, his voice clipped and professional. Catherine, I was just about to update you on the Grand Line filings. Not now, I said quietly, glancing back at the house. I need to confirm something else. Did Aurora finalize the purchase of the Harper mortgage? A pause, then papers shuffling on his end. Yes. 2 months ago. We closed with First National Bank. You're the lien holder of record. The deed will transfer if they default. Why? I exhaled a thin stream of vapor rising in the cold. Because they just sat in that room and divided the estate between my sisters as if I don't exist. David's tone softened. Catherine, you don't have to let this eat at you. You already own more than they could imagine. That house is a drop in the ocean. I know I said my voice steady, but it's not about the money. It's about the truth. They think they're casting me out that I'll be left with nothing. They have no idea the ground beneath them is already mine. Silence stretched for a moment, the line filled only with David's steady breathing. Finally, he said, Do you want me to draft the notice of ownership now? Not yet, I replied. Timing matters. For now, let them believe I'm the forgotten daughter in the garage. When the moment comes, they'll see just how wrong they were. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. My breath came easier now, even in the freezing air. The Harper house stood behind me, 2 stories of red brick ivy, creeping along the sides. Christmas wreaths hung neatly in the windows. To anyone else it looked warm, inviting the perfect family home. To me it was just a stage, a facade. And like every stage, it was waiting for the curtain to rise. I shoved my hands deeper into my coat pockets and walked slowly toward the street. The crunch of ice under my boots loud in the quiet neighborhood. My heart no longer ached. It beat with something sharper, cleaner. They had written me out of their legacy. What they didn't know was that their legacy already belonged to me. I turned back, once looking at the house, and let the corner of my mouth curve upward before heading down the block. The house was glowing with warm lights when I walked back in that evening, though none of the warmth touched me. Guests filled the living room coats piled on the rack by the door, voices rising in laughter above the soft carols playing on the stereo. Candles flickered along the mantel wreaths and ribbons draped across every corner. The dining room table had been reset this time for the larger Christmas dinner. The smell of roasted ham and spiced wine drifted through the air. I slipped into the room quietly, but Olivia's voice cut through the noise before I had even taken my seat. She sat proudly near the head of the table, her hand brushing against Charles Benson's sleeve as she spoke. Charles, tall and silver-haired, the CEO of Grand Line Hospitality, nodded along with interest, a glass of wine in his hand. And that's why I was chosen to spearhead the restructuring. Olivia said, her voice bright, confident. It wasn't easy, but I streamlined departments, cut unnecessary expenses, and the numbers already look better. They're even talking about promoting me to Vice President of Operations in the new year. The table erupted with polite admiration. My mother clasped her hands together and beamed at her, her eyes shining with pride. My father chuckled approvingly, giving Charles a nod of affirmation. She's always been sharp, he said, as if he himself had shaped her brilliance. Charles lifted his glass in Olivia's direction. She's one of our rising stars, he agreed warmly. A real asset to Grand Line. We're fortunate to have her. Laughter and clinking glasses followed. My parents glanced down the table at me. My mother's smile softened into a look of faint condescension, as though she pitied me for sitting in the shadow of my sister's triumph. My father's eyes lingered a moment longer, cool and assessing, before he turned back to Charles. I held my fork steady and said nothing. Inside, bitterness stirred. I thought of the names and faces buried in the spreadsheets Olivia claimed as victories. I thought of Kelly, of Sam, of dozens of others who had lost their jobs because of Olivia's efficiency. They weren't just numbers. They were people. Breadwinners, parents, veterans. Their livelihoods had been stripped away by her eager hands, hands now folded neatly on the table beside a crystal glass of wine. I looked at her laughing beside Benson, basking in the glow of attention. She sat like a queen, sure of her throne, blind to the cracks forming beneath her. The conversation shifted to vacations and stock tips, but Olivia steered it back again. Grand Line is stronger than ever, she announced proudly. Our profit margins are up, and I've been told our restructuring has saved millions already. Millions. The word echoed in my head not as triumph, but as a red flag. I remembered the reports spread across my desk just a week earlier. The losses from her so-called initiatives weren't small miscalculations. They were catastrophic. The Chicago property's renovation had stalled because key contractors walked away. Guest satisfaction had plummeted 15% after staff cuts. Supply chain bottlenecks had increased costs, not reduced them. All told, her decisions had cost Grand Line nearly $5 million this quarter alone. And here she was spinning it as a triumph while the man sitting beside her swallowed every word. I chewed slowly, my face impassive. I didn't let myself smile, not yet. The irony was sharp and sweet in my chest. My company Aurora Hotels held the controlling shares that would soon bring Grand Line under my direction. Charles Benson was praising Olivia without knowing the ground was already shifting beneath his feet. My mother reached across the table to pat Olivia's hand. "We're so proud of you, darling," she said, her voice full of warmth she had never once used with me. Amanda sat quietly at the far end, one hand resting on her stomach, eyes lowered. She forced a smile when Olivia glanced at her, but it didn't reach her face. Mark Ever, the chorus to Olivia's lead, laughed and added, "Imagine how lucky the company is. She practically saved them single-handedly." I sipped from my water glass, the taste flat and metallic. They believed her. They always believed her. And they believed I was nothing. I set the glass down and folded my hands in my lap, my expression calm, almost serene. Let them celebrate her. Let them toast to her brilliance. Let them think I was the shadow, the failure, the one exiled to the cold garage, because the truth was already written in black ink on the reports in my possession. Olivia sat there drunk on her own self-importance, glowing in the praise of Charles Benson and my parents, not knowing that her empire was paper-thin. And I knew as I watched her lift her glass in another toast to herself that paper burns quickly when the fire comes. The dinner had stretched into small talk and laughter, the kind of chatter that floats over wine glasses and clinking silverware, when I noticed a woman step into the dining room behind one of the invited couples. She carried herself cautiously, her eyes scanning the room before catching sight of Olivia. Her body stiffened immediately. She froze halfway to the table, her breath caught in her throat. I recognized that look, the reflex of someone who had been wounded once and didn't want to be anywhere near the one who hurt them again. It took me a moment, but then I remembered her face. Kelly Johnson. She had worked for Grand Line, one of the mid-level managers in guest services, before Olivia's so-called restructuring gutted the department. I remembered reading her file, her stellar reviews, the testimonials from guests who praised her leadership, and I remembered the cold red stamp on her personnel record terminated. Her eyes darted to Olivia, who was basking in Charles Benson's approval, still playing the role of golden child. Kelly's hand twitched at her side as though she wanted to turn back, but then her gaze shifted again and landed on me. Her entire face changed. Relief washed over her features, her shoulders dropping from their tight line. She whispered something to the friend at her side, then made her way toward me, weaving carefully between the chairs. I stood as she approached. "Ms. Wilson," she said, her voice trembling at first, then steadying. You saved me. If it weren't for you, I don't know where I'd be right now." Her words were soft, but clear enough that the guests at our end of the table quieted to listen. I reached for her hand, but she pulled me into a hug instead, her gratitude raw and unfiltered. "You took me in," she went on, her voice breaking slightly as she pulled back. "Aurora gave me more than a paycheck. You gave me dignity. I run the front desk operations in New York now. My staff respects me. My guests know me. I have a career again. You believed in me when she..." She stopped glancing at Olivia, then turned back to me. "When others didn't." I smiled, steady and warm, and held her shoulders. "You earned it, Kelly. All I did was see what was already there." Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded quickly, composing herself. Around the table, murmurs rippled. Some of the guests looked at Olivia, others back at me, sensing something they couldn't quite name. I caught Olivia's stare from across the table. Her glass was halfway to her lips, her fingers tightening around the stem. The confident curve of her smile had faltered. Her eyes burned sharp and furious, though she masked it quickly with another shallow laugh at something Benson muttered beside her. But I had seen it. That flicker of panic. That jolt of recognition that her carefully polished image wasn't as bulletproof as she thought. I hugged Kelly once more before letting her rejoin her friend. The hum of conversation returned, though it carried a different undertone now, less certain, more curious. I lowered myself back into my seat, my fork untouched on the plate, the food cooling. My chest felt warmer than it had all night. Because this was why I had built Aurora. Not just for the deals or the numbers, not just for the balance sheets and valuations, but for people like Kelly. The ones discarded by those who saw only figures to cut, never lives to support. Olivia destroyed and I rebuilt. She reduced people to statistics, and I turned them back into human beings. The contrast was stark, so stark, in fact, that it could no longer be ignored. Across the table, Olivia leaned in closer to Benson, whispering something into his ear, trying to reclaim the spotlight. But her posture betrayed her. Shoulders tighter, laughter higher than before, smile too forced. The mask had cracked, and she knew it. I set my napkin back in my lap, lifted my glass of water, and took a slow sip. The taste was cool and sharp, like victory waiting patiently at the edge of the evening. And when I lowered the glass, I let myself look directly at her, just long enough for her to see that I wasn't hiding anymore. The room had grown louder as the wine flowed, laughter bouncing against the walls. Plates scraped clean forks clinking against porcelain. Olivia was in her element, her voice bright, commanding every sentence calculated to keep the spotlight fixed firmly on her. She leaned forward toward Charles Benson, tilting her head just so her tone carrying across the table. "I took a hard look at our technical department," she said, her words crisp, self-assured. "It was bloated, wasteful. I streamlined it, cut the dead weight. We're leaner now, more efficient. It was the right move, and the numbers already prove it." Murmurs of approval circled the table. My mother smiled proudly, as if she herself had taught Olivia how to wield a scalpel. My father nodded slowly, pleased by the talk of numbers, of strategy, the language he always respected but never expected from me. I sat quietly, pressing the tines of my fork into the edge of my plate, forcing my face to remain neutral. Inside, my memory lit up like a screen. David's email flagged urgent only days before. Attached were pages upon pages of legal documents. A class action lawsuit filed by a group of former Grand Line employees claiming wrongful termination. Among the names highlighted was one I remembered instantly: Sam Brooks. Sam, a veteran who had served in Afghanistan, honorably discharged a man who had spent years keeping a roof over his family's head by working the technical side of hotel operations. Olivia had swept him aside with the stroke of a pen. No warning, no severance, no chance to retrain or reapply. Just gone. And he wasn't alone. Dozens of names filled the list, each one a story. People who had given years of their lives to the company, cut loose like scraps of paper from Olivia's file folder. Aurora Hotels had taken the case on quietly funneling resources, paying for the attorneys who would fight for them. David had insisted we stay invisible, let the justice system work on its own. And that was fine by me. I didn't need credit. I only needed results. I looked at Olivia, smiling wide, her hand brushing against Charles Benson's sleeve as she spoke about efficiency. She didn't see the people she'd hurt. She never had. She only saw numbers savings on a ledger, bullet points on her resume. But I saw Sam's tired eyes when we first met at a veterans employment fair. The frustration in his voice when he spoke of being cast aside. I saw Kelly's grateful smile earlier tonight, a woman rebuilt after Olivia tore her down. I saw the names, the families, the human cost she refused to acknowledge. And for the first time all evening, I felt something close to peace. Because justice wasn't a fantasy anymore. It was already moving, already circling. The same pride Olivia was parading now would be the stone that dragged her down. The laughter around me dimmed as Charles Benson's phone buzzed against the table. He frowned, glanced at the caller ID, and the color drained from his face. He excused himself quickly, pressing the phone to his ear as he stepped into the hallway. The chatter at the table faltered, then picked back up, but quieter, more uncertain. I watched through the corner of my eye as Benson's broad shoulders stiffened in the doorway. His voice was low, urgent. He paced once, twice, his free hand tugging at his collar. Olivia noticed too. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes following him, her expression flickering with unease before she caught herself and straightened. A moment later, Benson returned. His smile was tight, brittle. He lowered himself back into his chair, the lines in his forehead deeper than before. He set the phone down carefully beside his plate as if it were loaded with something volatile. Olivia leaned toward him, her voice light but edged. "Is everything all right, Mr. Benson? Work intruding on our holiday?" He forced a smile, shook his head once. "Just an internal matter," he said, his tone clipped. But his eyes betrayed him. They were dark, unsettled, still carrying the weight of whatever had been said on that call. I held my glass in both hands, lifting it slowly, savoring the cool water against my lips. I didn't look at Olivia, not yet. She was already squirming, sensing a shadow she couldn't name moving closer. And I didn't need to say a word. The storm she had summoned with her own arrogance was already on its way. The hum of conversation had shifted thinner now, carrying a nervous edge, as if everyone at the table sensed something had cracked. Guests leaned toward each other in quieter tones, their laughter fading. Olivia didn't notice, or maybe she refused to. She raised her glass, her smile painted on her voice louder than before. As I was saying, she began her words clipped with determination. "My initiatives have saved Grand Line millions. Entire departments realigned, resources streamlined. It's about vision, about leadership." She looked around the table as if daring anyone to challenge her. No one did. My parents leaned in with pride etched on their faces, eager to bask in the glow of her accomplishments. My father nodded firmly. My mother patted Olivia's hand with admiration. I lifted my wine glass slowly, letting the stem turn cool between my fingers. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The Cabernet slid over my tongue, rich and dry, and I let it linger before swallowing. Behind the calm mask, my mind replayed numbers like ticker tape. 5 million lost in 1 quarter, guest satisfaction down 15%, key contracts, broken vendors walking away, projects stalled. Every boast Olivia made replayed against the cold truth I had seen on spreadsheets across my desk at Aurora. Maria had presented the findings, her tone calm but firm. Her cuts look impressive in the short term, but long term she's gutted their ability to grow. We're watching an implosion disguised as progress. Ben had added his glasses, reflecting the numbers on the screen. She's accelerated losses, not prevented them. If they keep letting her lead, they won't recover. I remembered nodding, my hands folded tightly in my lap, not from nerves, but from restraint. Restraint not to march into my family's home and reveal it all. Not yet. Now, watching Olivia preen beside Charles Benson, I felt the same restraint pulse through me. Her words tumbled on confident, arrogant. "I know it's hard to make these calls, but I've proven myself. Grand Line is leaner, stronger, and ready for the future. They'll see it when I take the vice president's seat." I set my glass down gently, the sound soft against the linen. A strange mix swirled inside me. Anger for the lives she'd damaged, pity for her blindness, and something close to amusement. She sat on a throne built of sand, declaring herself a queen. Charles Benson shifted in his chair, his posture tighter than before. He nodded absently at her words, but his eyes were far away, still shadowed by whatever he'd heard on the phone minutes earlier. A bead of sweat glistened at his temple despite the warmth of the room. I tilted my head slightly, catching his unease, and then it happened. His phone buzzed again, a sharp vibration against the wood. He glanced down, and for the first time all evening his composure truly broke. On the screen, bold and undeniable, were the words Aurora Hotels. CEO, his lips pressed into a line. He snatched up the phone, his hand almost trembling, and muttered a quick apology as he rose from the table. Olivia blinked, caught off guard. Another call, she asked lightly, but her voice pitched too high, betraying her nerves. Must be important. Benson didn't answer. He strode toward the hallway, his shoulders stiff, one hand tugging at the edge of his jacket as though he needed more air. The table buzzed faintly with speculation. My father muttered something about these corporate types never resting. My mother shook her head sympathetically, as if she understood the burden of great men. Olivia forced a laugh, brushing it aside. He works too hard, that's all. I sat perfectly still. I reached again for my glass, letting the wine coat my lips, and swallowed with deliberate calm. I knew exactly what he was about to hear. I knew exactly whose voice he was desperate to catch on the other end of that line. And I knew, sitting there in the warm glow of candles and Christmas lights, that the balance of the evening had already shifted. The room was still buzzing faintly, Olivia trying to steer the chatter back to her. But my attention stayed on the hallway where Benson had vanished, the faint sound of his low voice carrying back into the room. I didn't need to hear the words. I knew. I let my gaze return to Olivia, her laughter louder now, more brittle, her eyes darting once toward the empty chair beside her. She didn't see me watching. And so I sipped silent, the fire warming my chest while her confidence unraveled thread by thread. Charles Benson returned to the table slower than he had left it, his shoulders rigid, his skin pale beneath the glow of the chandelier. He tried for a smile, but it faltered as soon as it touched his lips. His eyes darted from face to face, never resting, as though the very air in the room pressed too heavily against him. Olivia leaned toward him eagerly, her voice bright and rehearsed. Where were we? Oh yes, the new supply chain model. I trimmed at least 10% of unnecessary costs. Millions saved in 1 quarter. She laughed lightly, tipping her glass toward him as though her words were gospel. He didn't answer. He only nodded, his hand tightening on the stem of his glass until his knuckles blanched. I pushed back my chair. The scrape against the hardwood floor cut through the room. Conversation dwindled. Forks, lowered heads turned. My pulse thudded steady but unhurried. I reached into my bag, fingers closing around the cool edge of metal. When I drew it out, the card caught the light. Aurora Hotels. My name etched beneath in bold, clear type, Catherine Wilson, CEO and founder. I laid it flat in the center of the table, right between the cranberry sauce and the bread basket. The metallic sheen glimmered under the chandelier. Silence swallowed the room. The Christmas music still played faintly from the stereo in the next room, some cheerful carol that now sounded absurdly distant, hollow. My mother's hand shook as her wine glass slipped from her fingers. It landed with a dull thud against the tablecloth, deep red liquid spilling across the white linen like a spreading wound. She didn't move to clean it. She just stared at the card, her lips parted, her eyes glassy with disbelief. My father's mouth fell open, the sound caught in his throat. He looked at me as though I had grown into someone unrecognizable in the space of a single breath. Amanda's hand flew instinctively to her stomach, her face pale, her eyes wide. She said nothing, but her shock radiated in the stillness. Olivia froze her fork halfway to her mouth. Her eyes flicked down to the card, then back to me, then to the card again. Her voice broke on the first attempt. No, that's not possible. She let out a laugh, brittle and forced. You're just a part-time teacher. You scrape by. You've always scraped by. I looked at her calm, steady, the weight of the moment, grounding me. Aurora Hotels, I said, clearly my voice carrying to every corner of the room. Valued at $250 million. I run it. I built it. And I know every number behind the stories you've been telling tonight. No one breathed. Olivia's face twisted, her disbelief slipping toward desperation. This is some kind of trick. A fake card. You... Her words collapsed into silence. She reached for the card with trembling hands, turning it over, running her finger across the embedded hologram, the security chip. Her hands dropped back to her lap, empty. Charles Benson leaned forward slowly, his eyes locked on the card, his jaw tight. I could see the recognition dawning in his expression, the puzzle pieces clicking into place, the reason his calls had gone unanswered all day. I sat down again, folding my hands neatly in front of me, and let the silence linger. No fury, no raised voice, only truth laid bare. And truth was heavier than any accusation. Olivia's breath came shallow, her chest rising and falling in quick, uneven beats. My mother pressed her napkin against the spreading stain on the table, though her eyes never left me. My father shifted in his chair, but whatever words he searched for refused to come. I held Olivia's gaze unwavering. She had spent years tearing me down with her tongue, years wielding power through mockery and cruelty. Now she sat speechless, cornered not by insults but by the undeniable reality in front of her. The silence stretched on thick, suffocating, until I finally lifted my glass of water and took a slow sip. When I set it down, the sound seemed to echo louder than any of Olivia's boasts. And for the first time in my life at that table, every eye was on me. Not in dismissal, not in ridicule, but in shock. The balance had shifted, and none of them, not even Olivia, could shift it back. The air in the dining room had turned heavy, almost unbearable, every breath drawn against the weight of silence. All eyes were fixed on me, my card still glinting faintly in the candlelight. I reached calmly for my bag, unzipped it, and pulled out my laptop. The sound of the latch snapping open seemed to echo louder than the carols drifting faintly from the living room stereo. I placed it on the tablecloth, brushed aside the wine stain that had bled across the fabric, and flipped the screen open. A soft glow illuminated my face. Fingers steady, I typed my password, and within moments rows of spreadsheets and reports filled the screen. Olivia's voice cracked the silence. "What are you doing?" Her tone was sharp, desperate. "This is ridiculous." I ignored her. With a few clicks, I pulled up the internal audit reports I had reviewed only a week ago. I turned the laptop toward the table so everyone could see. Pages of figures charts and highlighted notes glared back at them. "This," I said evenly, "is the real story behind Olivia's savings." I pointed to the first line item, my voice clear and steady. "Your initiative in the technical department didn't save money. It lost Grand Line $5 million in a single quarter. $5 million. Entire project stalled and repair contracts doubled in cost after you slashed your veteran staff." A murmur ran through the room. I scrolled down each number, another knife of truth. 15% of Grand Line's largest clients canceled their contracts after your so-called streamlining. Guest satisfaction fell by double digits, and more than 40 experienced employees, people who carried this company for years, walked away because you made their jobs impossible. Olivia's face drained of color. "That's not true," she stammered. Before she could say more, a voice rose from the back of the room. Kelly Johnson stepped forward. Her chin lifted, though her voice trembled slightly. "It is true. I was one of them." Heads turned as she moved closer. She looked directly at Charles Benson, then at my parents, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I gave 10 years to Grand Line. Guests knew me by name. Then Olivia cut my entire department, said we were unnecessary. I lost my job weeks before Christmas. Catherine?" She glanced at me, her eyes softening. "Saw my worth. She brought me into Aurora, doubled my pay, gave me a team of my own. I manage the front desk at the flagship in New York now. I've never been more valued in my life." The room rippled with whispers. My mother's lips parted as though she wanted to speak, but no sound came. My father's brow furrowed, deep, his hands gripping the table edge. Olivia's mouth opened, but before she could force out her denial, another figure rose slowly from the far side of the table. Sam Brooks. He looked older than his years, the weight of service and hardship etched into the lines of his face. His voice, however, carried with steady authority. "I'm Sam. I served 2 tours in Afghanistan before I came back and built a life at Grand Line. I was proud of that work. Then Olivia's cuts came down. I was told I was expendable, sent home without a dime of severance. No thanks for my service. No chance to fight for my job." He drew in a slow breath. But Aurora believed in me. They offered me a new role, one that respected the skills I'd spent years honing. And now I'm standing here not just as an employee again, but as a plaintiff. I'm leading a class action against Grand Line for wrongful termination. Catherine and her company made sure I had the support to fight back. And I intend to win. The room erupted in hushed gasps, forks clattering softly against plates. Charles Benson shifted in his chair, his face tight with discomfort, but he didn't interrupt. I sat quietly, letting their voices carry the truth that I had held close for so long. Each word from Kelly and Sam loosened the weight on my chest. For once, it wasn't me alone against the storm. It was them, living proof of what Olivia had destroyed and what I had rebuilt. Relief washed through me, steady and strong. Years of silence, years of swallowing humiliation, and now the truth wasn't mine alone to speak. It was alive in the room, undeniable. Olivia's composure shattered. "This is absurd," she hissed, her hands trembling against the table. "You're lying, all of you. Catherine is manipulating." "Enough!" My father's voice cut in, shaky but sharp. He looked at me, then really looked, his eyes wet and searching. "Catherine, is it true? Are you really the head of Aurora?" The table stilled every gaze, turning with his words. I held his eyes, unflinching. My voice was calm, measured, and final. "Yes, I am, and I'm no longer the shadow in this family. I don't need to beg for my place at this table." The silence that followed was deeper than any insult I had endured here. And for the first time, I wasn't the one shrinking beneath it. The room cracked open in chaos. Olivia shot to her feet, her chair toppling back against the hardwood. Her face burned crimson as she jabbed her finger toward me, her voice shrill. "This is a lie. She's making this up. You all know Catherine. She barely holds down a teaching job. She couldn't run a lemonade stand, let alone a hotel company." Her words rattled across the table, but they landed flat. No one laughed. No one agreed. Charles Benson cleared his throat, his voice low and heavy. "It's not a lie." He set his glass down with a trembling hand, eyes fixed on the polished tablecloth as though ashamed to meet anyone's gaze. "Aurora Hotels purchased a controlling stake in Grand Line months ago. The filings are public. The board and I signed off. Catherine Wilson is the majority shareholder. She is without question my employer now." The words seemed to hang in the air, suspended like smoke. Olivia's mouth opened, but no sound came. Her chest rose and fell in shallow gasps before she finally screamed, No, this is a setup. Some kind of scheme to humiliate me. You're all in on it." But even as she shouted, her voice cracked with panic. She looked around the table, searching for allies, for anyone to nod to support her. She found none. The guests whispered to each other in low, uneasy tones. A few shook their heads. One woman muttered, "Shameful." Another glanced at me with wide eyes, then back at Olivia with something like disgust. Sam Brooks rose from his seat again, his broad frame casting a shadow across the table. His voice carried steady and strong. "This isn't a scheme. It's justice. My name is on the lawsuit. So are dozens of others. And thanks to the evidence Aurora provided, we're going to win. The courts will see what you did to us." His words hit like a gavel. Murmurs rippled louder. Olivia's lips trembled as she shook her head violently, muttering, No, you don't understand." But it was too late. The tide had turned. I stayed seated, hands folded neatly on the table, my heart beating slow and even. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. The truth was already echoing louder than any defense I could have mounted. Charles Benson leaned back, pressing his palm to his forehead. "Olivia," he said quietly, "almost weary your position. It's gone. Effective immediately. I can't protect you from this." He let his hand drop, his eyes finally meeting hers, full of pity and finality. "Aurora owns us now. Catherine owns us now." The weight of his words struck harder than my own could have. Olivia's scream broke, jagged, animal-like. "You can't do this to me. I built everything I deserve." But no one moved to soothe her. No one believed her. The whispers around the table turned sharper, clearer. All that pride. Look where it got her. She ruined people. She thought she was untouchable. For years I had been the quiet one at this table, the one shrinking beneath laughter and scorn. Tonight I sat in the same chair, but I no longer felt small. I felt unshakable. Olivia's eyes darted back to me, wild and glassy, searching for some weakness, some crack. But I only looked back at her, steady as stone. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, resonant, each word deliberate. "I will not sleep in the garage tonight." The room stilled. The sentence was simple, unadorned, but it rang louder than her screams, heavier than Benson's confession. It was a line drawn, the final stroke of an old chapter. For a moment, no one moved. Then my mother pressed her napkin tighter against the wine stain spreading across the table, her hands trembling. My father leaned back, his lips parting in disbelief, the faintest flicker of shame in his eyes. Amanda held her belly, her expression unreadable, caught between loyalty and revelation. And Olivia stood alone, shaking her kingdom of lies crumbling beneath her feet. The carols still played faintly in the background, absurd in their cheer. The fire snapped in the hearth, throwing sparks. But the sound that lingered, that filled every corner of the room, was my voice. I would not sleep in the garage again. And with that, the world they had built around me shattered. Snowflakes swirled through the night air as I pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders and stepped off the Harper porch for the last time. The laughter and chaos from inside still hummed faintly behind me, muffled by the walls, but I didn't look back. The cold felt sharper, cleaner, almost like freedom. At the end of the driveway, a black limousine waited with its headlights casting long beams across the snow. The driver stepped out, straightened his cap, and opened the back door with a courteous bow. "Welcome back, Ms. Wilson." I met his eyes and gave a small nod. "Thank you." The warmth of the car wrapped around me as I slid into the back seat, the door closing with a firm click. The leather smelled rich, familiar, the kind of scent that belonged to boardrooms and late-night flights rather than childhood homes. The driver returned to his seat, and soon the tires rolled over the icy pavement, carrying me away from the house where I had been dismissed for years. As the limousine moved onto the highway, I leaned back, watching the city lights grow brighter in the distance. Cleveland faded behind me, and mile by mile, the dark horizon gave way to the shimmering skyline of New York. Towers of glass and steel rose like beacons, reflecting the moonlight and street lamps. Even at this hour, Manhattan glowed alive, vibrant, untouchable. By the time we pulled into the circular drive of Aurora Luxury Hotel, the snow had turned into a soft flurry, dusting the awnings and the marble steps. The building towered above me, its glass exterior gleaming against the night sky, every floor lit with the quiet pulse of life. My name, the company I had built, glowed in elegant silver letters across the entrance, Aurora Luxury Hotels. The doorman in a crisp uniform hurried forward, opening the car door before I reached for the handle. "Good evening, Ms. Wilson." "Welcome home." The words struck deep. Not as courtesy, but as truth. Home. Inside, the marble lobby shone under crystal chandeliers, polished floors, reflecting the soft golden light. Guests moved across the space with ease, their luggage rolling behind them, their laughter carried on the warm air. At the front desk, two receptionists straightened immediately when they spotted me. "Ms. Wilson, one of them said with a smile, her voice touched with awe. It's an honor. The manager on duty approached quickly, shaking my hand with genuine respect. Your suite is ready. We've ensured everything is prepared just as you like it. I thanked them softly and moved toward the private elevator, my heels clicking against the marble. With each step, the tension that had gripped me all night seemed to fall away like old chains finally broken. The elevator carried me upward, the numbers climbing until they reached the top floor. The doors opened to reveal the penthouse suite. My suite. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the room, revealing Manhattan in all its brilliance. The Empire State Building glowed in red and green for Christmas. The streets below alive with taxis and holiday lights, the Hudson shimmering in the distance. I stepped inside, slipping off my coat and laying it across the velvet sofa. Crossing the polished floor, I reached the window and placed my hand against the glass, the city sprawling beneath me like a living promise. I breathed in deeply, the weight in my chest lifting. For years I had carried the sting of rejection, the ache of invisibility, the wounds of being dismissed. Tonight, those years closed like a book. They no longer defined me. I didn't need their recognition. I didn't crave their approval. I had built something far greater than their acceptance. A company worth $250 million, thousands of employees whose loyalty was earned, not inherited, and a future that belonged to no one but me. I turned away from the window and let myself sink into the armchair, the city lights still casting their glow across the room. My mind replayed the evening, Olivia's smug grin fading into horror, my mother's trembling hands, my father's silence, the whispers of the guests as the truth unraveled. For years, they had written me as the forgotten daughter in the shadows. Tonight, I had rewritten myself. My voice whispered into the quiet suite, steady and certain. They thought I was just the girl left in the garage. The truth is, I'm the CEO of a $250 million empire, and that is the sweetest revenge. The words lingered, not bitter, not angry, just true. I rose again and poured a glass of wine from the chilled bottle waiting by the table. The deep red caught the light as I swirled it gently, then lifted it in a silent toast to the life I had claimed, to freedom, to power, to finally being seen on my own terms. And as I sat there, the city glittering at my feet, I knew the story had closed. The chapter of humiliation, of silence, of exile was finished. What lay ahead was mine alone, untethered and limitless. If you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or cast aside, remember this. Success is the sharpest answer, the one no one can argue with. Share your story, your triumph, because you never know who needs to hear it.